Hi everyone. Thank you, Amit. Thank you, the organizing committee, and thank you, Gili, and thank you, Professor Richardson, for joining us today. So yes, I will tell you a little bit about my dissertation. So first, let me briefly. Is that how? Okay. Yeah. What is transport planning? So traditionally, planners' role was to design road and public transport networks to best serve the private car, which represents the symbol of freedom. Transport, although evolving, is still an old-fashioned discipline and is considered a masculine field. When I approached with this topic to university staff, I was met with extreme dismissal. That is because what still leads traditional transport planning is the focus on monetary and temporal cost benefit. That is, the shorter the trip, the better it is assumed to be for the passenger and the economy. However, a new field of research, mobilities, aims to look into transport planning from a multi-dimensional perspective. Mobility is the act of movement, the personal experience, symbolic profit, social capital, and the meaning of being able to move that it offers. Spatial mobility influences well-being, happiness, interactions, and encompasses socio, spatial, political, and environmental contexts. These affect travel behavior and individual opportunities. Transport services and infrastructure create the notion and behavior of being socially and mobility excluded. Transport poverty and transport exclusion research look into immobility and its generators, how and where social injustices restrict mobility, and to what extent. Vulnerable groups are usually women, children, elderly, low-income households, people with disabilities, and ethnic minorities. I argue that queer people is another group that suffers from transport exclusion. Hate crimes against LGBTQ people in Israel are on the rise, affecting most harshly trans people. 25% of harassment or violent homophobic attacks reported in 2016 took place on public transport and in urban spaces. The latest report by the Israeli LGBT Task Force particularly mentioned public transport as a dangerous site for LGBTQs. There is a gender-biased mobility exclusion, as women feel less safe using public transport or active mobility modes, even though they use them more. Women negotiate their use of space by dressing differently and adjusting their routes, time, and mode of travel according to levels of fear. Antisocial behavior is the most common safety barrier to use public transport by vulnerable groups. But most safety policies deal with lighting after dark and not with violence elimination. Israel substantially lacks public transport services, and governmental infrastructure investments are mostly car-oriented. An extreme disadvantage of the public transport service is it does not operate during late night hours and weekends. Public transport is used by people with no other choice because of age, economic circumstances, or gender. Cities play a leadership role in influencing social norms, and Tel Aviv is a unique space in the Israeli landscape. Its image is promoted as a gay haven, but daily reality is sometimes different. So, this research aimed to examine how queer identity and performance affect and limit mobility opportunities. Which factors are taken into consideration by queer people when deciding to travel, how queer identity and performance affect and limit mobility opportunities and motivation to travel, how exclusion is dispersed among different individuals on different modes, and present queer mobility experiences. I assumed complexity and difference among queers' mobility attributes, and that queer people avoid traveling and activity participating since they feel less comfortable of their visibility at different times and on different modes, excluding them from social networks. I used a quantitative online survey and qualitative Skype interviews to collect my data. 4 Likert scales were created for the online survey. The independent variables investigated an individual's queer visibility, fear, and travel perceptions, and the dependent variable is the queer mobility behavior. The higher the score on each scale, the higher perceived queer visibility, fear, negative transport attitudes, and queer mobility exclusion. Okay, so the survey's results. First of all, gender identity and sexual orientation were presented as multiple answer questions to allow people to define themselves by more than one term. Most of the responders were Jewish, young, live in Tel Aviv, and were out of the closet. Unlike previous research in the field, a large portion of participants were trans or gender non-conforming, which helps to draw a more accurate and diverse image of queer mobility. Notably, 67% of the sample and 75% of trans people who responded do not own a car and thus are transit dependent. First results. So looking at main modes of travel, by time, the two constant main or secondary modes are walking and bus. During the weekend, walking is both the main and secondary mode of travel, while public service taxi, car, and taxi use increase. Bus and train are the most used modes to get to and from Tel Aviv. And bus is also one of the popular modes for trips that are shorter. Like work, school, and LGBTQ services. However, for long trips to friends or family that might live further away, car and train are more popular. It is very distinct that to leisure destination, the main mode is taxi, followed by public service taxi, meaning there is a requirement to pay higher fares for socialization destinations. Out of 12 considerations provided for responders, convenience is the prominent factor affecting travel decisions for all groups. Fear of harassment is only in the 8th place of considerations. 28% of all responders chose it, including only 3 men. This result was surprising and partially rejects the null hypothesis, assuming fear has greater impact on queer travel. In the Likert scales, the queer mobility scale has the lowest mean, and the transport attitudes scale has the highest mean. So, negative transport attitudes have the highest influence on queer people when traveling. All correlations between the 4 scales show a significant positive linear relationship, and as expected, those who fear more while traveling are mobility excluded more. Using multiple correlation, all statements were cross-checked to see what most influences each scale's score. So the higher trans or non-binary perceived appearance, the higher the queer identity score. Within the fear scale, the highest correlations are with the statements of feeling unsafe on the way to or from Tel Aviv and the lack of nearby LGBT leisure venues. Being attacked for being trans is also highly correlated with the fear scale score. In the transport attitudes scale, the highest correlated statements were I get negative looks on the bus and on the train. This outcome is incredible as these are the actions most affecting queers' negative transport attitudes, meaning it's not necessarily inadequate transport, but the uncomfortable experience on it. Lastly, within the queer mobility scale, as expected, the highest influencing statement is I will choose a longer route depending on what I wear. And yet, this scale had the lowest mean and frequency, so even though queers adjust themselves while traveling, it still has less influence on their travel behavior compared to other scales. 83% of participants have heard of at least one violent incident directed at LGBTQs while traveling, and 77% have experienced it themselves at least once. These are inconceivable numbers. Walking and bus are the least safe modes, and waiting at a stop is the following least safe stage of a trip. 2 more Likert scales were created, the average of hearing of and the average of experiencing anti-LGBTQ violence while traveling. A high correlation was found comparing fear and queer mobility scales with the hearing of scales. And in the case of being a victim, significant correlation was found with all the other Likert scales. Passing as a woman already increases chances of being harassed, and responders often cannot tell if it is because of their gender identity or queerness. Using a one-way ANOVA test, queer groups' results were compared. A significant difference with higher means for women compared to men is observed in the fear, attitudes, queer mobility, and to me scales. Between genderqueers and men and pansexuals and gays, there is a significant difference in the fear, attitudes, and queer mobility scales. Lesbians have significantly higher means than gays, and the same result is drawn when comparing bisexuals and gays. In all scales, the average scores are higher for trans people. As previous research showed, trans folks are excessively marginalized, and mobility is another example of this marginalization. The common choice in the online survey for what should be done to improve queer mobility is driver training, followed by improved frequency and reduced crowdedness. Modest steps mentioned are pride flags, inclusive language signage, use of pronouns that are not male-oriented, and inclusive advertisements in stops and modes. The main themes raised in the interviews were fear, passing, and public transport attitudes. Queers are familiar with the risks involving using public spaces, especially if their queerness is highly visible. While traveling, they are in constant level of fear, as traumas are daily. Fear changes by mode and time. Crowded buses are a triggering environment, while cars or motorbikes feel safer and provide the feeling of control. Train is an unfavorable mode, especially on Sundays and Thursdays when it's packed with soldiers. The train is crowded, claustrophobic, trips are longer, and riders interact with people from all over the country. All interviewees said that if public transport was better, they would not use or own a car. Queers use different strategies to stay safe and sane while traveling. To not invite incidents, queers withhold their queerness, refrain from initiating conversations with drivers, change to longer routes, use an unsafe mode, wear headphones, and get off from a bus at a further stop. Passing liberates from fear. Presenting manlier body language and appearance allows trans men, for example, to move easier through space. It is a way of staying safe that some do ordinarily, but can also be a cost. A group of queers can damage passing, so it can feel safer with friends, but attracts more attention. So queers are required to balance socialization with staying safe. The results clearly reveal an urgent concern regarding anti-queer violence in transport. Queers face extensive harassment while traveling on every mode or stage of a trip, and fear is the second most influencing scale on queer mobility. Negative transport attitudes are a result of both bad quality public transport infrastructure and the fear of using it because of hearing of or experiencing anti-queer violence. Queers use the least safe modes, knowing they are taking the highest risks. These are entwined with their daily mindset, forcing constant alertness for cues of potential violence. Being visibly queer is not strongly correlated with hearing of or experiencing violence, but it is with fearing and avoiding more. Resistance is an extraordinary conclusion of this study. Unlike the initial hypothesis, the main strategy queers perform is not avoidance, rather persistence and resistance. Although 77% of responders were at least once victims of anti-LGBTQ violence, their mobility was not drastically influenced. This is a result of lack of alternatives, be transport-wise or social prejudice. Queers do not allow or cannot afford fear to limit their mobility or regulate their identity. Walking increases fear and queer mobility adjustments, and yet it's the main or secondary mode among all groups. Queers, despite unfavorable circumstances, operate and move in the city. Queers have a complex set of considerations which supports the alternative hypothesis. Queer travel behavior includes unique components, the quality of transport services, and the relative safety to be compromised. A multidimensional approach is required when planning transport, investigating the intricacy of concerns different queer people have. Mobility is another aspect of discrimination. Invisible expenses like risk-taking, alertness, and pressure to resist take a toll on queers while traveling. Traditional cost-benefit analysis ignores the effects of transport arrangements on social groups and their expansion of social exclusion. The null hypothesis was partially rejected. Queers do not necessarily avoid activities or destinations, but specific transit mode or travel time to minimize chances of harassment. To reduce fear effects on travel behavior and increase use of sustainable transport, an understanding of the scope of violence queers deal with in transport spaces is required. Transport for London is the only major transport authority in the world that includes sexual orientation in the research and consult with LGBT interest groups. Mobility services can target queers by reducing fares, improving journey opportunities to key locations and events, offer flexible alighting from buses during night, improve cycling infrastructure, and install seats and grabbing handles that accommodate a diverse range of body sizes. Sustainable transport is investing in the other to promote equal distribution of access, social capital, and safety. Promoting transport inclusion policies will improve queer people's quality of life. Finally, being related to today's topic, being safe physically and mentally is an undisputable right of citizenship, and lack of it indicates exclusion and incompetence of the state. In mobility, fear is a form of exclusion that influences how modes of travel are used. And as citizenship and performance are sexualized, movement is as well. Queer spaces are important because they provide a haven from the heteronormative reality for queerness to be expressed. Queers' social capital suffers if they feel danger to travel. As queers challenge norms and achieve power, they liberalize cities. Yet no matter how gay a city is, as long as it's unsafe for travel while being queer, mobility is sexualized, and this sexualization is an excluding barrier that requires attention. Thank you.